Uh, I guess you need to go to the podium at the center of this room. Right. Thanks. And then you can share your screen.
Can you see it?
Yes,
can you
I
see
can.
this?
Yes.
But it's not. Oh, okay. Now it's on full screen.
Great.
Okay, but I can't see any of you. Is there a way for me to see anybody?
It should be in the right of your screen. If it's not there, I don't know.
Okay, well, I don't need to see you, I guess. I'll just...
You might try to minimize the presentation for a moment and see whether this way you are allowed to see all of us.
If I put it down, I can, yes, but I could try reading view. I think that works. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So it's time. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Next, the talk will be given by Professor Malinda Carpenter. She is working at the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of St. Andrews in United Kingdom. She obtained her undergraduate degree from the University of Florida, and then an MA and a PhD in developmental psychology from Emory University in Atlanta, in the United States. She did a postdoc fellowship at the University of Denver, working with children with autism, and then had a postdoctoral position at the University of Liverpool. After that, she moved to Leipzig, Germany. She worked in the Department of Developmental and Comparative Psychology at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. She was a member of the scientific staff, and she led a research group there for 5 years. In 2013, she joined the University of St. Andrews. Her research interest includes infants and young children's participation in shared activities, their prosocial and affiliative behavior, and their understanding of others' mental states. She also investigates the differences between ape and human social cognition. So Professor Carpenter will give a talk on what does it mean to share attention and knowledge today. Let's welcome her. Professor Carpenter, please.
Hi. Okay, so just interrupt, please, if you're having trouble hearing me or seeing the slides or anything, because at the moment I can only see my slides because it's full screen. Okay, so assuming that many of you don't know who I am, I'm starting with an introductory slide just to kind of introduce you to the different topics that I study. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and I study a variety of different topics, all involving social and pro-social development. And I mostly focus on infants, human infants and young children, and ask questions like getting at like what is the earliest age at which we see things like joint attention and communication and pro-social behavior. But I also have a more theoretical kind of bent to my work in which I'm trying to figure out theoretically what do these kinds of skills involve and where do they come from and why do these skills develop when they do. And as a sort of secondary line to my research, I've done some studies as already mentioned, with apes, particularly chimpanzees, in particular to ask questions about what is special about human social cognition, how does it differ from that of the cognition of other animals. And these kinds of questions are really informative, because it's only when you start asking what's different about humans compared to our nearest living relatives, the chimpanzees, that you start to see differences popping out at you. So again, chimpanzees are our nearest living relatives. They have very complex social lives. They form complex they have social dynamics in their everyday lives. They form coalitions and alliances. They have dominance hierarchies that influence their behavior. They have a complex system of communication, mostly gestural, but also vocal communication. And their physical cognition is very advanced too. And they can use and create tools and do all kinds of things. But clearly, if you think about human cognition and social cognition in particular, it's just very different, right? So we build skyscrapers and smartphones. We collaborate in all kinds of ways, from little to big. So just from moving a sofa together when we're moving house, to collaborating on big ideas, to playing in symphonies. We have many different languages and many cultural institutions like money and marriage and government. These are all things that arguably, at least, are special, unique to human cognition. So when thinking about what is it that can start to explain all these unique aspects of human social cognition, we proposed that one main thing is shared intentionality, or the skills and motivation to share goals, attention, intentions, and many other psychological states like beliefs with others. And it's this shared intentionality that enables humans, and we would argue only humans, to engage in collaborative activities and to share experiences with each other and to create these kinds of cultural practices and institutions by sharing beliefs together. And this isn't a big, complex thing that only adults can do at all. This begins early in infancy with joint attention, which is one of the earliest instances of shared intentionality. And so it's going to be what I'm going to focus on for much of this talk. Okay, so what is joint attention, and why should roboticists and many other people be interested in it? So let's make sure that we're all on the same page about the definition of joint attention first. Okay, so joint attention, its classic definition is that it's a coordination of attention with others to an object of mutual interest. Okay, and everybody who studies joint attention agrees that this is an absolutely foundational critical skill for things like learning language, cooperation, and all types of social interaction. And it's not just something that infants do. This is something that we do as adults all day, every day, whenever we're in social interaction. We're attending to things together, talking about the things that we're attending to. We use it for cooperation and all kinds of things. Okay, but coordination of attention, what does that really mean? We've been studying for joint attention for over 40 years, but everybody has their own definition or own idea of what joint attention means. So I'd like to go through this in detail. So there are a couple behaviors in particular that are commonly taken as evidence of joint attention. So some people would argue that all of us are in joint attention right now because we're all looking at the same thing. We're looking at this talk. And others would take gaze following as a particularly clear example of joint attention, because one person follows the other person's gaze to what they're looking at, and so they end up looking at the same thing. So they would take this as a coordination of attention. Both of these things, you're looking at the same thing. But I would argue that where is the jointness here? These things are not necessarily joint. They can be, as we'll see, but they are not necessarily joint. So imagine in the Obama example here, what if Obama didn't know that Sarkozy had snuck up behind him and was following his gaze? They would be looking at the same thing, yes, but how is their attention coordinated or joint or shared in any way? It's not necessarily. Instead, they could just be in parallel individual attention, looking at the same thing, but not even aware of each other's presence. In the case of Obama, and being aware of Sarkozy, of course. Okay, so what does joint attention really involve? Well, following Tomasello, I think the key, there's a key aspect to it, which is this knowing together aspect. So not just do you have to be looking at the same thing, but you have to be mutually aware. You have to know together that you are attending to the same thing. And it's this third leg of the joint attention triangle that's so important to my very strict definition of joint attention. This is what makes it joint. Okay, so what does this look like? So here is an example, a video of a 9-month-old infant and his mother in joint or shared, as we'll see, attention. And it's a beautiful example of joint attention, but it goes very fast. So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen and then show you the video and then show it to you slowed down so you catch all the nuances of it. So the mother is going to pick up a rubber duck and squeak it. And the baby apparently didn't know that this duck could squeak, and he finds that really cool. And they look up to each other in this beautiful moment of sharing how cool this rubber duck is. Okay. Okay, so it's that moment where they're looking up at each other and smiling and talking, so to speak, communicating about this, the coolness of this rubber duck. That is the joint attention moment here. So I'll play it in slow motion here. Watch the baby's face. You'll even see this little eyebrow flash on his part, and that he's starting to smile even before he looks up. So he's not just catching the smile from the mother. He has something he wants to share with the mother, and they share it, and it's just this wonderful moment between them. So this is the simplest thing. It's just a look and a smile, but it has so many consequences for later development. It's so important for all kinds of things in infant social development. It's been called a meeting of minds. So it's not just sharing attention to the same thing, but sharing and aligning your attitudes with those of another person about things out in the outside world. Okay, and the classic view is that this emerges around 9 months of age. We have some new data that shows that if you test it in a certain way, you can get it down to about 6 months of age in some infants. So it's between 6 and 9 months of age that this is starting to emerge, possibly earlier in some infants. And so this kind of shared looks to the other, these communicative looks, are emerging around this time, but joint attention becomes much clearer when infants are able to initiate joint attention through the use of gestures, declarative gestures like showing objects to others to share something about them, or declarative pointing to objects to point them out to parents or caregivers so they can share about them. Okay, so remember that there's this key component in joint attention, according to this definition, where you need to know together that you're attending to the same thing. Well, this requirement brings up a very difficult philosophical question, and that is how is it possible that a 9-month-old or 6-month-old baby can do such a thing? And the reason this is such a difficult question is because classically, joint attention has been seen to involve a very complex type of mentalizing, so recursive mind reading. So thinking, I see that he sees me seeing him see me see infinitely this object. So clearly, you know, a 9-month-old baby arguably, presumably, can't do anything like this. And also, it's not really joint in any way. It's just two individuals individually reasoning about what the other can see and know. So I've argued that something more joint is needed to get at this key component of the joint attention triangle. And one solution to this, which is nice, is that eye contact. Juan Carlos Gomez has made this point that eye contact results in attention contact, and he uses the analogy of mirrors reflecting into each other. So the eye contact kind of gives you for free this recursion. When you look into somebody's eyes, you can see them seeing you, and you get some of that recursion sort of for free. But as you'll see later, I think that there's something more to it to make in the prototypical joint attention situation, like the one that we just saw. I think that you need some sort of communication, even if it's just a communicative look, like that little eyebrow flash and smile that the infant gave in the video you saw. And that this mutual knowledge, this knowing together, is achieved when each partner simultaneously tells the other, in a sense, just with a communicative look at a minimum, that they're sharing attention. So it's a bidirectional kind of communication that they're sharing. So we've been thinking about joint attention quite a bit, and part of the problem we realized with Barbora Suposova, who was a PhD student of mine at the time, is that when people talk about joint attention, they're talking about a variety of different things under the same term of joint attention. And so we came up with this a framework of different levels of social attention, so individual versus social attention, to try to tease these different types apart. And I thought it might be relevant to people who study robotics because, as we'll see, I mean, it may be the case that it would be easier for robots, for example, to do some of these types, but not others. And it's helpful to maybe point out to people which ones they can and can't yet do. And I'm not an expert on this. This is something that we will save for discussion and maybe talk about later. Okay, so we identified 4 types of social attention, moving from least shared to most shared. And a key aspect to this that we consider is the difference between taking a third person perspective on the other person versus being in a second person relation with the other. And hopefully this will become clear in a moment. And this idea was heavily influenced by philosophers and psychologists who had been talking about this distinction before us. Okay, so remember the gaze following example. This is monitoring attention. So one person is just individually tracking where another person is looking, and they end up looking at the same thing. So it's Sarkozy is thinking he's looking at this from a third person perspective, treating the other as a he or a she. In the audience example, we can call this common attention because we, like, you can think about the person 3 rows back from you and think that this person is also watching the slide and knows that you're watching this talk. And you can think the same thing about people remotely watching it and so on. So you're just using assumptions and inferences and perspective taking to each know that you each know or each are watching this talk together in a sense. And then come the 2 types of attention that involve being in an interaction in a second person relation, a you kind of relation with another person. So this isn't a main level. The shared attention is the main level that we're concerned about, but we identified this mutual attention level that that doesn't happen much in real life, but we couldn't ignore it. So it's here. It just involves looking at something, each of you looking at something, but then almost incidentally or accidentally making eye contact briefly about it. So you both know that that you've made contact about this thing. But shared attention involves, in addition, some sort of communication, like even just a smile and raised eyebrows or something, or a verbal communication about the thing. Okay, and we argue that it's these 2 that we should be calling joint attention, not the others, because these are the ones that really do involve you jointly doing something together instead of individually just reasoning about the other person. Okay, and so, yeah, so I think I mentioned that gaze following can be joint attention, but it isn't necessarily, and it can be when you have this eye contact afterwards. So if after Sarkozy follows Obama's gaze, they look at each other and make some offensive comment or something, then they will have engaged in shared attention because they've made this contact and communicated about the thing. Okay, so we also realized that common knowledge, the term common knowledge or mutual knowledge, has been used equally vaguely or in various different ways in the literature. So we suggest using similar corresponding terms for the knowledge states that are related to these attention states. Okay. Okay, and so we realized as we were thinking about this, that although I've presented the different levels in terms, from left to right in terms of less shared to more shared, you would think that in development, the more shared ones would be harder, but that doesn't seem to be the case at all. So we see shared attention already in some 6-month-old kids and basically all 9-month-old typically developing infants. It's something that develops very, very early. It's more consolidated later by 12 months when kids are pointing and showing things and so on. But it's there very early. Mutual attention hasn't really been studied. It's just not something that happens very often, but I bet that it's very early too. However, monitoring and common attention are more difficult and likely develop much later, or later anyway, between 18 months and 5 years. Those are the ages at which we have the best evidence for those things. And so it's interesting to think about robotics and whether in the evolution of robotics, which ones come first. So I know that there's some work on monitoring attention, so following others' gaze. That has to be possible easily with eye tracking. Easily, I say. It's easy for me to say, but it's has to be possible because eye tracking is already getting you far along the steps to monitoring attention, and common attention should be pretty easy to work out who's looking at what. But can a robot engage in real joint attention? I mean, yes, you can fake it by having them, smile and emote in certain ways and communicate when they look at the same thing with somebody. But is that really real joint attention? That's something that maybe we can discuss later. Okay, so just quickly, we also make the point in this paper that these levels can apply to sharing of all types of different mental states. So I'm not going to go through this example to save time, but we can come up with the same type of framework for sharing goals, for example, all the different levels of sharing goals. You can, just to take one example, you can monitor somebody's goal. You can see that they have the goal to go participate in a protest to end racism, and you can say, oh, that's a good goal, so I'm going to do that too. And you just do it individually. And we go through examples of each of these things in the paper, but I'll skip that for now because I want to get through some other things. Okay, and again, we would reserve these 2 levels in which there's a second person relation. We would call those joint action, but the others not. Okay, so to summarize briefly so far, I'm claiming that I'm advocating a strict definition of joint attention and joint action, and claiming that they're not really joint unless they are actively shared with one's partner. And the sharing involves communication of some type, even very minimal communication. And that even very young babies, some starting by 6 months, 6 to 9 months, are starting to engage in shared attention. Okay, so what is this shared attention and the related things? Shared attention, shared knowledge, common ground is a related thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but I will talk about next. What are all these things good for? I've hinted at this somewhat, saying that it's foundational for language learning and so on, but I'm going to run through a few studies now to show just how useful it is in things like communicating and prosocial behavior and joint action. Okay, so the first thing that it's probably joint attention is most associated with is language and communication. So if you think about it, I mean, it must be a terrible problem for roboticists and people who are working with artificial systems to come up with systems that can interpret language, human language, which is so complex, in human-like ways. Because much of our communication is ambiguous if we don't take into account the common ground that we share with our partner, our conversation partner. So by common ground, I just mean the things that we have shared in the past or that we're currently sharing right now. Okay, so if you think about the simplest type of communication is perhaps pointing. Pointing itself, all by itself, conveys very little information. It's basically just a signal saying, look there. So if you imagine you and your friend are walking along the street, and one of you points at a bicycle, leaning up against a restaurant or something. This point, just silently, without anything, could mean all kinds of different things. It could mean, hey, that's a nice bike, or that color, that's the color I wanted to paint my bedroom, or do you mean wheels like that? Those are the ones you want? Or even something really complex like, oh no, your ex-boyfriend is here, let's go somewhere else. Okay, you can get all that just from a silent point. At a bike, if you have a rich common ground, this wouldn't work with a stranger who doesn't have any common ground with you. So your common ground with your friends can help you identify what the referent is of the point. Is it the whole bike, just part of it, the color of it, the cost of it? Whoa, that's an expensive bike. Or the owner of it, like the ex-boyfriend. It can also, maybe with some facial expressions or words too, identify the motive, why is this person pointing about this thing? Okay, and we've shown in a series of studies that infants, even one-year-old infants, as they're just learning language, can use this shared experience that they have with other people, their common ground, to comprehend ambiguous points. Okay, so they can understand which of several objects an experimenter is referring to, for example. So in this study, we had infants play with 3 novel objects, and they played with the first 2 of them with this experimenter who's standing up here. Then she left the room and they played with the 3rd object with another assistant. So the experimenter who left the room didn't see that object, and then she returned, and all the objects were put on a tray and counterbalanced or random order, and the experimenter came back and gestured at the tray ambiguously, excitedly, and said, oh, look at that. Oh, can you give it to me? And infants knew that she must be referring to the object that she hadn't seen before, that she hadn't played with them before. And so they gave her that object, for example, that one of them. So they knew which object she must be referring to based on what they had shared with her before. And we have so that's the basic procedure of the Thomasell and Hoggle study. And in the Mull et al. Study, we have various control conditions to show that it's really the experience that they shared with that individual, not just what she knew or what they knew about the objects. Okay, and they can also figure out what an adult is trying to tell them what they should do with an object based on the common ground they've shared with that adult. So in this study, we had infants play with one experimenter. They played one game, a cleaning up game, where they threw various objects that were on the ground into a basket to clean them up. And then with another experimenter, they played a puzzle game in which they put objects into a puzzle. And then one of those experimenters pointed at a new object. And depending on which experimenter that was, the infant, so infants had engaged in both activities, but depending on who pointed at this final object, they did different things with it. So if she was the experimenter who had cleaned up with them, then they went and put it in the basket. And if she was the experimenter who played the puzzle with them, then they put it in the puzzle. Okay, so it's not just comprehension too that infants use common ground for. They also decide what to point to for others, depending on the common ground that they've shared with their partner. So here we had infants play one game with one experimenter. So they shared a bunch of teddies, they played with them together. And then they shared another game with another experimenter. They played with a bunch of ducks with that experimenter. And then at test, we had one of the experimenters lead the infants into a different room where there were 2 pictures on the wall, one of teddies and one of ducks. And the question was, which picture would infants point to for that particular experimenter? And they pointed to the teddy for the experimenter who had shared teddies with them, and the duck to the experimenter who had shared ducks with them. So they're deciding what to point to based on what might be of shared interest to them, interest to their partner. Okay, so those involve directly shared experiences, but we've also shown that older children know something about cultural common ground. So this is the things that we know, we in our culture know, and we know that other people will know them, even if we've never interacted with those people before and those objects before. So we tested this by having several pairs of objects. So here's one of them. In each pair, one of the objects was just a random kind of novel, homemade looking figure or object, and the other part of the pair was a culturally familiar object. So in this culture, Father Christmas, Santa Claus was very common, you know, well known to the kids. Everybody should know who Santa Claus is in that culture. Okay, so then we had infants get to know, you know, play with these two objects with one experimenter alone with that experimenter. And then a new experimenter came into the room. This experimenter had never seen these things with infants before. They were novel to her in that sense. And this experimenter saw these two objects up on a shelf together and gestured towards them both together ambiguously, again, like as in the other procedures that I told you about. And she either said, depending on which condition the kids were in, she said, "Ah, look, who is that?" Or, "Ah, look who's there." So either in a questioning kind of way versus a recognizing way, and then asked children ambiguously, "Can you give it to me?" And children gave her the novel object, the green thing, when she had asked questioningly, who is that? And gave her the culturally familiar object, the Santa, when she seemed to recognize it, even though they had never shared anything with this person directly in particular. Okay, so this is just, we have many other studies on this too. This is just a couple of them to show how common ground, what we have shared in the past, or what we share with others in a cultural sense, is helpful in both comprehension and production of communication. Okay, so let me move on to some different ways that joint attention and common knowledge and related things are helpful for other things. So let's go back just for a second to our levels of attention, and remember that there's a scale of sharedness. So the more joint an interaction is, the more certain you are that our attention is shared. Because here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but say for in common attention, you are just making inferences individually about what the others must see or know and what they think you see or know. But in shared attention, at the most shared level, you have actually had an interaction directly about this thing with the other person. So you are certain that attention is shared. And because you're certain of this, the more joint an interaction is, the more certain you are of this, the stronger the obligations and conclusions that come from it can be. So if you have communicatively shared attention to something, you can't later say that you didn't see it. So if you shared the rubber duck with your mother, well, if you shared it with your roommate or something as an adult, you can't later deny that you've ever seen that rubber duck before. She would know that you have in fact seen it because she was there with you when you saw it and you experienced it together. And if you, thinking of joint action instead of joint attention, if you have communicatively agreed on your shared goal, you've decided, let's do this, then you're committed to it, you're obligated to it in a way that is less strong or less certain than if you just thought that you might have the same goal as somebody, as in common goals, for example. Okay, so, sorry, just one second. To illustrate the first point about creating obligations, so we all know, and we're all happy we all know that we should give our seat on the bus to somebody who needs it more than we do. We're all happy to do this in most circumstances. It's sort of an unspoken obligation, and it makes sense. It's a nice thing to do, right? But you know, you have to admit that there are some situations where you're really tired or you're really sick and you don't really want to give up your seat. So how can you kind of get away with that? Well, you can do it by pretending you don't know that there's somebody there who needs help. So if you don't want to get out of your seat for somebody else, you can look out the window, put your headphones on, and pretend like you don't know that there's somebody who needs your seat. That's the only sort of acceptable way to get out of giving up your seat, because you can deny later if pressed, if scolded about it. You can say, oh, I didn't know, I didn't see her. It's not my fault. So we wondered if kids knew about this trick, basically. And in the meantime, we were looking at the role of common knowledge in the obligation to help somebody else who needs help. Okay, so what we did was study 6-year-olds. We had them watch a video first, wearing headphones. And then when the video was over, we asked them to keep the headphones on without any sound playing in them, just to set up the procedure for the next part. And in the common knowledge condition, the experimenter knew, and the children knew this, that although they were wearing headphones, the children could still hear external sounds. So the experimenter said, oh, I see you're wearing headphones, but I know that you can still hear. Whereas in the individual knowledge condition for the other half of children, the children believed that the experimenter could not hear them. So they heard her say, like, start to talk to them, but then say, oh, she's wearing headphones, she can't hear me. Okay, so then came the helping test to see whether children would help the experimenter more, as predicted in the common knowledge condition, when they knew that she knew that they knew that she needed help. Okay, so this is, I'm calling this common knowledge, not shared knowledge, because children are behind a barrier. They never made eye contact at this point. It's only about what others know, right? Whether the need for help is known or not known by the child. Okay, so the children are behind a barrier, collecting stickers for themselves from the special sticker box. And the experimenter here on the other side of the barrier is hopping around noisily on her crutches, saying, giving some auditory cues to let kids know that she needs help. So she's saying things like, oh, my leg hurts, I wish I could sit down, but there's a box on the chair. And children knew that this box could be removed from the chair because they had seen that before in the procedure. And we found that, as expected, children helped more when the fact that help was needed was common knowledge between them. So when they knew that the experimenter knew that they could hear her, they helped more. And it was the kids who thought that she didn't know that they could hear them, who kept on collecting stickers and didn't help as much, possibly strategically thinking, oh, well, she might not realize that I can hear her, so I'm not obligated to help. So this is just to show that common knowledge can trigger or create obligations to help by removing this plausible deniability that help is needed. Okay, let's see, I'm trying to decide if I have time. I think I'll have time to do this quickly. So, so another type of obligations in the context of joint action is our joint commitments, okay? And these have always or almost always been studied verbally in the past. But in this study, we wanted to know whether commitments could be created non-verbally in certain situations with communicative eye contact, but not non-communicative eye contact. So we're looking specifically at the role of communication in the creation of joint commitments, even nonverbal communication. So this study was loosely based on a sort of childhood situation. I grew up in Florida, so we went swimming a lot. And you know, you get to the pool with your friends and you know the water is icy cold. And so that first jump in can be fun in some ways, but it can also be absolutely miserable in some ways because it's so cold. And so sometimes you make a deal with your friend, let's jump on 3. And, you know, in the best case scenario, you both jump in at the same time and then you enjoy the shock of the icy water together. But in the worst case, you say 1, 2, 3, jump, and you jump, and your friend stands up on the side of the pool, pointing and laughing at you, calling you a sucker. So, you know, that's what you want to avoid. This is a coordination problem. You want to make sure that if you have agreed to jump, that you both jump. So this study is based very loosely on that experience. We studied 6 to 7-year-olds and put them in a situation in which they learned a game, which was they had a choice. They could either decide to sit on the beach, which was just a little bench covered by material that looked sort of like sand and beach. If they did that, they could receive a small prize, a kind of boring sticker. But if together they decided to jump into the lake, this blue rug with fish decorations on it, then they could receive a really cool sticker if they both jumped together. Okay, so it's sort of loosely based on the stag hunt kind of reward structure. And in the training, they played this game several times and they made the decision about where to jump verbally together. But then at test, a no talking rule was introduced where they said, okay, now you can't talk. All you can do is look at each other through this tube where they could only see each other's eyes, and you have to make the decision that way without talking. And so right before they had to make their decision, the experimenter looked at them either with communicative eye contact or with non-communicative eye contact. And the prediction was that kids would not only expect that she would jump more in the communicative case, but also treat this as a commitment to jump together with the child. Okay, and this is what we found, that children in the communicative eye contact condition risked this cooperative decision more often than children in the non-communicative eye contact condition. But it was more
I think there is a connection problem, right? I think Malinda has a connection problem. Let's wait for a minute.
While we are waiting for the connection problems to get fixed, just a reminder to ask questions after the talk is over. You can come here where I'm standing in the Q&A podium line here to ask your question. And if you're listening this to Zoom, you can post your question to Zoom and we will try to relay it here. Also, if you have problems coming here, just send a message in the chat. Remember, please, to post it, to direct it to everyone so that everybody can read your question. Thank you.
It seems she has completely logged out. We will wait for a few minutes to see if she come back again. Not yet.
Again, a bit of this time to invite you, all the speakers also of the previous sessions, to stroll around the area in Gathertown, and you can have different occasions to talk with other people in the venue. As you might have noticed, if you walk close to someone else, you can immediately establish a video communication.
Philosophers are talking about it quite a bit. Computer scientists, I think, more and more. And so this will allow better crosstalk if we're all talking about the same thing when we use a term.
Malinda, I guess you got disconnected when you were talking about the jumping into the pool. and
Oh,
then you
dear.
got disconnected, and we didn't hear the following part.
Okay.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay. No, I'm sorry. It's my problem on my end. Okay. Well, the pool study isn't so important. Here's, I don't know if you saw these slides, but
Yes, we were on the first line of this slide.
Sorry.
Oh, we were on the first line of this slide, and then you got disconnected.
Okay. Okay. So right, this study is not as crucial to the rest as the others. So I'm going to just summarize that it was enough to see the experimenter give a communicative look to the kids for them to not just expect that she would jump into the lake, but also to treat that as an obligation, as a commitment that she said, I'm going to jump in the lake. Just even though she said nothing at all, they protested after she didn't then jump in the lake, saying things like, you should do what you said you would do, even though she had said nothing at all. She had just made eye contact with them. So this is just to show that communicative eye contact can create joint commitments in a joint action context if the situation is right. Okay, and so I summarized these. You've already heard all of this before. This is just a summary that even very young infants, 6 to 9 month old infants, can engage in shared attention that involves mutual knowledge. Okay, so there are many advantages to adopting a common framework of terms. Whether you agree with the terms we've chosen or not is something that we can discuss. But there are lots of people now who are discussing joint attention. Psychologists have been for 40 years, and philosophers as well. Computer scientists are doing so more and more, I think. And this will allow better crosstalk across fields, so we're sure that we're all talking about the same thing and can make more progress. And similarly, there are separate literatures on joint attention and joint action, and if we use similar terms, we're all wrestling with the same kinds of issues of jointness, then we can make more progress. And we can also avoid many heated but unnecessary debates if we are all making sure that we're talking about the same thing, defining our terms. So we have had an ongoing debate with people like David Levins about who is capable of engaging in joint attention. So we have argued, I'm not 100% wed to this idea anymore, but we have argued that joint attention is probably, and joint action is probably unique to humans. But many people have claimed joint attention in both various types of animals as well as robots. And the answer to this question of who is capable of engaging in joint attention depends completely on the definition that you use. So following gaze is often taken as joint attention, but if you say that it isn't necessarily joint attention, then you're talking about different things when you use that term. So we just have to be clear about our definitions. I'm going to skip this next part. It's just saying that although apes can follow gaze and know a lot about what others can and can't see, they don't arguably engage. So they engage in very similar behaviors. They have all the prerequisites that they need to engage in joint attention and declarative gestures, but they arguably don't do this. You never see this kind of situation where they're just sitting on the floor and playing with something and looking up to each other in wonder at something that they see. Okay. So this might be a question of motivation. So there's a big motivational component to infant shared attention. Imagine all the wonderful things that kids see in their lives. It's worth noting that they will look away from these things in order to look to their caregiver to share them. That look to the caregiver is just as rewarding, if not more, as seeing these wonderful things in their lives. Okay, so go back to the beginning of my talk. If you think about all the special things that humans do that are unique to humans, that involve sharing goals, sharing ideas, sharing beliefs in the sense of cultural institutions. So for money to be valuable, we have to believe that it's valuable. We all have to have a shared belief that it's valuable. Otherwise, it's just paper, right? All of these things, these very complex human, unique kinds of things, arguably are based on just a look and a smile. So joint attention early in infancy. And it's interesting to think about, what robots are capable of doing, whether they can do these things or fake them well enough, perhaps, or whether they need this motivational component somewhere, if that's a key part of joint attention. Anyway, we can discuss these kinds of things in the discussion period. But just before we get to that, I just wanted to mention that I'm very interested in robotics. I'm not a computer person in any way, but I'm very interested in talking about, what joint attention, or what any of these things, what imitation involves, what these things involve, and robotics would be an interesting way to do that. We just got an email from our university global office asking us to try to identify potential collaboration partners. This particular email was about partners within the EU, but I'm sure they'd be interested in partners from everywhere. So they're talking about things like offering programs like PhD co-supervision or exchange opportunities or research trips for students, or just any types of academic collaboration. So if you might be interested in any of these kinds of topics, you can write me at the email address there. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'll try to unshare my screen if I can find it.
Thank you very much. This is a very impressive technology introduction and discussion about joint attention. Do we have some questions? If you have questions, we go from good. We have Mohan have a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Malinda, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Interesting talk. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of maybe a robotics and cognitive systems person. Okay, so if I misuse any of the terms, sorry. So I'll start with this potentially simple question of when you talk about this notion of joint attention, whether it's like based on whichever modality, visual, or other things. One thing that as roboticists or AI people may struggle with is like, what should be is there any shared common representation? What is it that these two, if you want to call them agents, have to have such that they can engage in joint attention or joint action or anything of this form? So I was interested in knowing your perspective. What kind of things do you think, given that you looked at it in different projects, so to speak, what kind of common vocabulary, what is that you think is required to engage in this kind of joint attention or joint action?
Okay, so do you mean, like, do they need a thought bubble with the person in it looking at the thing? Is that what you mean by representation?
Or like, okay, so imagine the two people have to talk, just as a different example. They need to have some kind of shared vocabulary to be able to say that, okay, we are going to together manipulate these things, but this is in language. But now if we were to think about sort of attention, thinking of focusing on something together, or acting on something, thinking about acting on something together, they need to be able to refer to either mentally or verbally or whatever way of things in such a way that the other collaborator sort of understands. So what is your take on this? What do you think is this? That's what I call representation, some shared notion of different things in the world that they have to think about, act on, or so on.
Okay. Yes, this is one of the many reasons why it would be interesting to collaborate with roboticists, because you make me think about things that I've never even thought about before, because it just never came up. It's just something that we kind of assume and don't have to think about. So in the case of a nonverbal infant, that's very interesting, because I haven't really thought about it before. So I think what's happening is they are kind of assuming that people see what they see, but it's not as simple as that, because we already know that 12-month-old infants point differentially for people who are knowledgeable versus ignorant about something. So they are keeping track of what others see or know. It has to be nonverbal at that point. They must just, I hate the idea of them having a picture in their head of what's happening. So, but I don't have a clear answer right now about what it is in their head, what kind of picture representation they have in their head. I need to think about that. I'm sorry. I don't have a clear answer for that. And clearly it sounds
This was a curiosity question because this is something we struggle with because it's largely task domain dependent on what to do. All right, like, and so I was wondering if you had some insights from, say, people, so to speak, small people, little people. But it's okay. I will take this up offline. I'll let the next person come and speak.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, go ahead. Yes, Yusuf. Oh, you need to unmute first. Good.
Yeah. Hiya. Yeah. Isn't swarm technology an example of joint attention? The reason I say is because in a robotic swarm, the agents usually have a common understanding, right?
Are they? What is this understanding? Are they communicating with each other about the goal or the target, or?
Yeah. Well, essentially, they all have the same goal and system internalized.
Okay.
They're all aware of the same thing.
I think I might call that common goals because they each have it individually. Well, it depends on how they're interacting, whether they're interacting with each other, whether they're all just kind of in parallel going to the same thing, or if they are in constant communication with each other about the thing and adjusting their movements to achieve their collective goal.
Yeah, well, for example, like a swarm of drones could have, all these agents, they could share a common map. They could all, have access to the same infrastructure in their system, I was wondering if that might count as a common understanding and ultimately joint attention.
Common, certainly. In the terms, in the framework that we use, I reserve shared for something that involves communication. So if they are communicating in some way with each other and can change their behavior based on the kinds of communication that they receive from others, then sure, I could call that something like, joint action. For sure, but it would require some sort of communication or interaction in some way if we wanted to use, if we were trying to fit it along that scale, and I was trying to choose a term for what to call it, then yes, but I'm happy to call it common goals.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. I see people are waiting in queue. Next one. I cannot see the names because people are standing together. Sadahi?
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
good.
thank you very much for your very interesting talk. So I had a question with respect to the imitation, and I was wondering if did you investigate if joint attention would result in a better imitation experience?
I don't know of any studies on that directly. My guess is yes, but imitation is a way of creating this shared experience together too. I mean, there are different types of imitation. One is just where you kind of learn from somebody, just again, from a third person kind of perspective. You can see somebody on the other side of the room and learn like which fork to use at a dinner table or whatever. That's not as interesting as imitating each other in order to create a shared experience with each other in a very social kind of way. And if you do that, then that kind of results in joint attention. If you're aware of the fact that you're imitating each other, then you're attending to the interaction and the imitativeness of it. That's kind of backwards from what you're saying. You were saying, does being in joint attention result in more imitation? We do know that imitation is more likely in contexts where people like each other and so on, and joint attention is definitely a way of improving or having pleasant social interactions. So my guess is yes, but I don't know of any specific studies on that yet.
Thank you.
Yes, Alexander.
Hello. I'm relaying a question from Giulio Sandini from Zoom. Most of your examples were related to interactions between two persons. What about the development of shared attention in a triadic situation?
With 3 people. There is some old work on that from Michael Tomasello's lab, and it's more difficult to, you're stretching my memory here, but my memory is that, so if you have a father and 2 siblings or a mother and 2 siblings, it's more difficult to engage in like high quality joint attention than if you are in just a dyadic situation, because you're kind of having to spread things out and keep track of more different people. So it's slightly more difficult, but it's certainly possible even for children in that kind of sibling kind of situation. In a peer situation, it would be much more difficult. So kids are much more likely to engage in like good quality joint attention with an adult than with peers at young ages.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there some other questions?
If there is no one, I would like to ask one, if it's okay, but I already had my chance.
Please go ahead. Let's see. Please go ahead, yes.
Can I? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So, Malinda, it's Mohan again, back for a follow-up. Sorry. I was just curious, like, I asked you previously about some kind of shared vocabulary. I also wonder if there is, to the extent that you can, how to say this, explore this or probe this, do you know if when these 2, say, human agents, if you want to call them that agents, when they engage in some kind of joint action or joint perception, anything, some kind of joint activity, do they manipulate each other's systems? Like, can one guide the other person to think or act in a certain way, and by doing so, do they change their representations of the task?
Yes, sure. So if, like, it happens all the time that an infant will pick up something nasty, a dead bug or something nasty off the street, and show it to their mom, excitedly, and the mother goes, "Oh my God, that's disgusting, and put it down." And so the infant then drops it and is horrified by it. And so clearly the type of communication that they receive can affect the other person's behavior, and that can happen does happen in joint action, where if you pick up a sofa together but you struggle on your end because it's too heavy, then your partner either has to make some adjustment to make sure that you don't drop it or have some kind of injury or something. So that happens all the time. And I'm trying to remember what was the last part of your question.
So can communication okay, let me try to be clear here. Can communication influence a person's or one of the agents' perception of the world in such a way that they can end up learning incorrect views on something which they themselves individually would not have picked up? Is it possible?
Sure. I mean, if the other person is wrong, like if your mother is wrong somehow about what she's telling you about things, then you would learn something incorrect about the world. So, yeah.
And even if that even if that goes against what you yourself might do individually, you still keep that communicated. I mean, can that overwhelm your individual perception?
Yeah, sure. It depends on how susceptible you are to that kind of thing. So, like conformity, it's bringing to mind the conformity literature, where we some 30% or so of people will conform to a group decision even when they know themselves that it's wrong. They'll just conform to it. They keep their individual views. They just conform only when in public. So maybe in that sense they don't change. But I do think that we get, like, maybe especially in an authority like mother-child kind of relationship, we might change our views thinking that the other person is right, instead of, it would depend on how obvious it is, I guess. I mean, if it's really obvious that she's wrong, you would hopefully keep your own view and just kind of fake it for her or something. So I guess it depends very much on the situation, what you're asking.
Thank you. Mothers are always right? Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, do you have a question? I see Martin is.
Yes,
great.
I have. My question is that we were talking about having a common knowledge, like this swarm using a common map. But wasn't this more about communicating where my attention is currently? Like it's more like acknowledging that you know that I know, or I know that you know, What's the role of this factor? So it's not just about acting on some large pool of common ground, but picking up a certain thing from that large pool that is like the most important right now, because I'm communicating. I can see that you are looking at this. How would you comment on that?
I'm not sure I completely understood the question. So yes, sorry, can you?
I try to rephrase it. I come from computer science as well, and usually an artificial system has a vast knowledge base, or whatever it is, and it can be shared with the human agent if we're talking about human computer interaction. But at the moment, the system is paying attention to just the small subset of its knowledge, and it's important to communicate what is this small subset that I'm paying attention right now. And that's how that's what I took from your talk, that this is an important part of shared attention. So please correct me if I got it wrong.
Okay, I think it's not necessarily what we're looking at now. It can be something that we talked about hours or months or years even ago, if it's salient enough. So it's what's most relevant to the situation. So like in a pointing example, if I point ambiguously to something, you have to kind of search as a human, even search your database of all the things, all the possible reference and messages that I could be trying to convey for you. And the ones that are most relevant to our shared experience, not just so the philosophers have come up with ways of, talking about how it's not just what I know about you. Like if I secretly saw you doing something, but you didn't know that I saw you, I can't consider that as relevant in the point that you're making for me, because you will assume that I'm pointing about something that's relevant to to our shared understanding. So you kind of have to search what you know together to come up with the best fitting possible referent and message of this piece of communication. Sometimes we're wrong about it. We make mistakes. We say what, or we guess the wrong thing and we realize it's a mistake, and then we clarify it, and that's fine. But it's not always the thing at the moment that we're attending to. It can be something completely different, but it's a search to find the most relevant answer to the question of what could she be talking about, I think. I'm not sure that answered your question.
Yeah, that perfectly answers it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Linda.
Hi, I just want to report one question, and I saw on the chat of Gather, there is MC that is thanking for the talk and is asking, I believe that my dog is capable of joint attention as you defined it. However, it emerged only after he was 9 years old. Am I totally wrong? And there is also another reply saying that in relation to that question, does shared attention require high recognition, or can an innate behavior that results in some kind of shared attention also be considered? So this is what was being discussed.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was convinced at one point that my cat engaged in joint attention with me just once, only once in all the years that I had him. So, and dogs are very social creatures. They're very used to humans. So I would not be so surprised if a dog could do this, because they're communicating by barking and all kinds of things. So as I said, I'm distancing myself a little bit from the strong claim that only humans and only humans can ever engage in joint attention. I think there might be some cases of other animals doing it, but it is absolutely clear to me that they don't do it to the same extent as human infants and people in general. So I'm open to the idea that some animals might. Dogs are one of the few that I would list, the top few of my list. Dolphins might be too, because they're incredibly social. Higher cognition was the next point, whether that's required. Well, it depends on what you call higher cognition, because these are 6-month-old babies, have sort of minimal cognitive abilities, but they are engaging in shared attention. So you need to communicate, you need to know what other people are looking at or other individuals are looking at. And you have to have some way of, having opinions and expressing opinions about these things. So I don't think, looking now at the chat, that learned or stereotyped kind of behaviors wouldn't necessarily count. There are people that argue that birds, when they're doing their rituals and things, engage in joint attention because they know what each other are trying to do. But if they don't really know it, and it's just a fixed action pattern or something that's just coming out unintentionally, then I can't call that shared attention. It just doesn't seem to have the requisites for me.
Okay. What's
excuse me, could I just ask one follow-up question on this, or is the time already short?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, maybe just quick. Yeah, I understand this argument also, that especially from innate or very simple behavior, that this may not considered to be really some shared attention and so on, but especially from the perspective of developmental aspects. So I was wondering, like, at least those simple innate behaviors, if this could be some kind of basis when like that ignites like somehow kind of some learning of really some shared attention then in some developmental process or something. Is this considered, or is this kind of not really like appropriate to assume something like this?
It could conceivably be the basis for it, but you just need a lot more on top of that, I think. The way that we talk about it as psychologists, there is some cognition involved, and but yeah, it has to come from somewhere. It's not just appearing magically out of the blue. So you need to sort of be able to predict others' behaviors and know what they're likely to be looking at, and so that some of that might be not, learned in simpler ways, I guess. This is a question we haven't really thought about. I'm coming from the Tomasello lab, where everything is very cognitive and social, and so we're thinking at high levels, but it's worth thinking about where the simplest, the initial abilities come from, both in humans and potentially in other animals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you.
Okay. I know the talk is very interesting and we have lots of questions, but we only have 4 minutes left for a break. Let's have a short break and
let's go.
finish the next one.
Okay, yeah, get in touch if you want to talk more about anything.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Malinda.
Thank you.